This week's Bible study is on Psalm 118, verses 1 to 2 and 14 to 24. Please read through the psalm before you watch this video. From Easter Day to Pentecost, the lectionary doesn't have an Old Testament reading as the first lesson, but rather it sets a series of readings from Acts, which have as their emphasis the proclamation of the early church and the importance of the work of the Holy Spirit in enabling that proclamation about Jesus to be both delivered and heard. So rather than delving into Acts, I thought over the next few weeks in these Bible studies, we'll stay in the Old Testament by looking at the Psalms that are set instead. So this is the psalm for Easter Day, and I would recommend that you read through the whole psalm, even though the lectionary focus is only on specific verses. If you're the kind of person who has an eye on the lectionary, you may have noticed that this same psalm is also set for Palm Sunday, which we've just marked, and the verses at the end of the psalm are particularly appropriate to that occasion. Although some of the verses selected for Easter Day are different, there is also a significant overlap. So we can see that this is a psalm of great significance, particularly in the context of salvation history, which we celebrate most specifically in the resurrection of Jesus on Easter Day. The psalm begins with a formula for thanksgiving. "O give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, his steadfast love endures forever." In the first 4 verses, and again in the final verse of the psalm, this refrain is repeated. His steadfast love endures forever. Verses 5 to 13 then describe the rescue of the psalmist from the assault of other nations. A seemingly hopeless situation has been transformed by God's radical action. In verse 13, the psalmist concludes that, "I was pushed hard, but the Lord helped me." This is the reason why the speaker is giving thanks to God. In the context of Easter, we can read this psalm perhaps as the voice of Jesus, who has been attacked by the powers of death. It's only by the greater power of God that the life of Jesus is wrenched out of the grip of death, and this is the reason why thanksgiving should be the dominant mood on Easter Day. Verse 14 makes a powerful claim. "The Lord is my strength, my might, my salvation." This echoes the language of Moses, who celebrates God's defeat of the Egyptian Empire and the liberation of Israel in Exodus chapter 15, verses 1 to 3. If you look at those verses, you'll see that this psalm really picks that up. And if you look at the way the psalm is laid out, verse 14 appears to act as some kind of conclusion to the preceding verses that describe the circumstances from which the psalmist needs rescue. But this verse 14, also provides the basis for what follows on in the rest of the psalm. God's recent rescue of the speaker becomes the foundation for the hope that follows. Verses 15 to 20 mention the righteous several times, and these verses also let us know who they are. The righteous are not necessarily the good or the obedient or the pious. Rather, the righteous are the ones who are vindicated and rescued by God. In verse 15, we read about the tents of the righteous where the rescued live. In verse 19, the gate of righteousness through which the obedient enter to worship. And the entry of the righteous, the willingness of the rescued people to come to worship, is described in verse 20. This community is made up of people who have known God's massive action on their behalf and who live their lives in thankful response to that action. Although elsewhere we might want to look at the moral dimension to righteousness, here it is purely about receiving God's powerful love. They are not righteous because of anything that they've done, but because of what they have received from God. And so the righteous don't congratulate themselves, but they are exuberantly grateful. They turn attention away from themselves and towards the saving power of God, and so they sing in verses 15 to 16 3 times about the right hand of the Lord, which is a way of talking about God's powerful, continuing purpose and presence. The church knows at Easter just as this psalm knows that Easter would not have happened and new life would not have been possible without God's powerful activity. It's because of that right hand of power that the psalmist concludes, "I shall not die," in verses 17 to 19. I was about to, I could have, I nearly did, but I didn't, because God moved against death. Death is a formidable power which wants to take control, but God will not let it happen. In this psalm, death is not seen simply as a negative state, but as an active force for evil. However, evil is nothing compared to the power and will of God, and this is a cause for singing. It's been noted that the entire structure of these verses depends on understanding death as an active force which cannot withstand God's power and authority. Neither this passage or the resurrection claim of Easter make any sense unless God and the power of death are perceived to be in profound conflict. Perhaps this seems a bit unusual to us in our modern lives, the idea of death as a hostile power that threatens us. Or perhaps that is how we feel about it. And this is what this psalm is about. One commentator put it like this: "This is what Jesus knows between Friday and Sunday. Jesus is being undone by the power of death, and the world is being undone with him. But Yahweh did not give me over to the power of death, because God has kept me for the power and prospect of life." The reading ends in boundless gratitude. God has answered. God has heard the need. God has rushed to intervene. God has changed death to life. God has overpowered Friday for the sake of Sunday. The rejected one, left for dead, is the valued one. So what a day this is. The day of rescue is a day for joy. Easter Day is Life Day, New Day, Beginning Day. It's a special day. For those who let the claims of this psalm saturate and inform our living, every day is a gift of new life. This is the day of God's power for life, and so it's our day of singing and gratitude. On this day, we celebrate that God's people are at a beginning and not at an ending. If you would like to reflect on this psalm further, here are some things that you might like to consider. Read through the psalm again slowly, taking notice of any words or phrases that stand out for you. How does reading the psalm as though Jesus is the speaker affect you? Does it help you to see things differently? Try to write your own version of this psalm, or make a list of the things that you are thankful for, using the formula of the opening verses. Think of a time when you have felt under attack or beset by forces beyond your control. Think of a time when you have felt that circumstances could easily overwhelm you. How have you felt God's help at these times? How do you respond to the idea that righteousness is God's gift to you? That it's not about what you can do, but it's yours because you have received God's powerful and amazing love. Think about how Jesus' death and resurrection is reflected in the psalm, and spend some time in praise and gratitude for the new life and the new beginning that are ours in him.